Hey, what's going on, everyone? So, okay, just get a drink a cup of coffee here. Okay, so Daniel, good to see you. Thanks for jumping in. Let me know if you have any plans for the weekend or anything. Okay, you guys, we're supposed to have like a guest today, one of my former clients, Randy. Good to see you. Well, Randy's one of my former clients, but he got sick today, so he called out, so we're going to reschedule. So on the live today, I know a lot of people do grocery shopping on the weekends. Andy, good to see you. So on the live today, we're going to do a last minute topic shift, and I'll definitely interview my client on another week. Jay, good to see you. But today we're going to be talking about how to source like high quality beef. I know a lot of people do their shopping on the weekend, so it's perfect timing. You can kind of go ahead and put these tips to practice, and everyone thinks it's very easy to find high quality beef these days, and they think maybe like the average consumer thinks all beef is created equal. But actually finding legitimate high quality beef in the US is extremely difficult. In fact, I spent close to 4 years researching the agricultural industry, which is what resulted in me writing my second book. And I started that project with only presuming it would last about 2 weeks because I thought it would be that easy. I'm like, well, in 2 weeks, I'm going to find out all the answers and I'll be able to source high quality food in America and it's going to be no problem. And even to this day, it's already 4+ years later, I'm still find certain aspects of it complicated in terms of how to source actual legit high quality food. And before anyone, Megan, hey Megan, good to see you as always. David, Daniel, fun with some family. Good to hear, Daniel. Spending time with family is always great. But I'm still even perplexed and kind of confused about certain topics of the food industry. And before someone even says anything like, oh, high quality food, I shop at Whole Foods or Costco or whatever. Look, America's health right now is a disaster. 9 out of 10 Americans are like metabolically unhealthy. 9 out of 10 American adults. Jerry, good to see you. And it's kind of rare to run. I mean, like you go outside anywhere in America these days, and 9 out of 10 people you run into are full of obesity, misery, and disease. And in fact, being healthy and looking in good shape is so rare, it's actually become like a luxury item. You know what I mean? Because basically, like almost no one has it, and obviously it's more sought after if no one has it, et cetera, et cetera. Where that's kind of like silly in my opinion, because everyone should be in good shape, and in fact, everyone was in good shape, especially pre domestication of animals and crops. Okay, pre farming, when everyone was a hunter gatherer, et cetera, et cetera. Just being in shape was like a default. They didn't have like a 401k plan, medical plan, LA Fitness, Equinox, whatever, and they're all like jacked all the time, you know? They didn't have like a life coach, personal trainer, guru, whatever. And they're all in great shape all the time. And if you take out child mortality, they lived into like very old age, okay? And one of their secrets is they relied basically on wild game, wild fish, and wild seasonal crops, whatever they can find. But most of the calories definitely came from wild game and wild fish, because obviously you can imagine, imagine you're like lost in the forest and you had blueberries with you. Like it's probably your longevity of life is not going to be that great. But imagine if you like just recently killed a moose or something. Imagine how long that kind of meat would last you, etc. So it would increase your lifespan. So obviously the calories are mainly coming from the meat and the fish, not so much wild crops. So obviously wild game isn't attainable for most people, which I get it, I mean, if you hunt and everything, it's cool, you can get it. And if you want to, you could do it. It's not that hard. Hunting license is like $10 or $15. It's like a weekend course. And then obviously you need like a rifle or a bow or whatever, which you can get, like even a used one for like $400 or $500 and pretty much ready to go. I would recommend hiring a mentor, but that's totally up to you to do that one, to take you out the first time around. So for most people, hunting isn't like an option. Wild game isn't an option, although that is the A+ food group. But you can still do a lot as like basically a civilian that's not into hunting and still wants to source high quality food. So we're going to be using beef as an example today because most people eat beef at some portion or another. Chicken is actually the most popular kind of meat in America to consume, but beef is also popular as well. So let's go down the list, because when you go to the grocery store, it could be kind of overwhelming, especially these days. You have like so many different labels and certifications or whatever. So I have some notes here to remember, and we'll just kind of go down the list. That way you know what all these labels mean and you're not going to be confused, and you can make the best decision for yourself. So let's break it down. So when you go to the grocery store, you basically have a few different options, okay? There aren't that many overall. So one, and the most common, most popular one, is basically grass-fed and grain-finished beef. So you guys have to remember, all cattle are raised on grass, on pasture, okay? So when you see the label like grass-fed, it really doesn't mean anything extraordinary, because pretty much 80% of a cattle's life is spent on pasture, eating grass, maybe supplemented with a little bit of grain towards like the middle or end portion. But out of that category of cattle, about 98+% then for the last 20% of their life, for like a few months, et cetera, are sent to what's referred to as like a feedlot. And the whole purpose of a feedlot from a business perspective is they keep them enclosed in these kind of lots, basically. I'm sure you guys have seen it once in a while, at least in documentaries. Alvin, Ian, good to see you. At least in documentaries. And the whole purpose of that is they don't move around that much. And then on top of that, they can feed them a lot of grains, which kind of help put on the pounds. Because remember, it's a pound per pound industry. So obviously, the heavier the animal, the more money the farmer is going to be able to make. So that's the most common beef. And you see that sold a lot at Costco, Ralph's, Albertsons, Whole Foods as well, et cetera. And so there are a few things you have to consider here with grass-fed and grain-finished beef. So first and foremost, you have to understand like what is the natural diet of cattle, of cows, It is a herbivore diet. So they basically live off grass and forage pretty much their entire life. So if humans weren't around and they weren't domesticated, that's their go-to food group, and that's what they would be eating. And when an animal eats what I refer to as a species-specific diet, their nutritional profile is optimized as well. But when they're fed like a non-species specific diet, such as grains, a few complications could happen depending on the longevity of that diet, and also, the way it's sourced and the way those grains in this example are made. So for example, when a cattle is fed grains, first of all, it's not its non-species specific diet. So what happens from a nutritional perspective is it offsets the balance, the ratio of omega-3 to omega-6. So in grass-fed beef, like legit 100% grass-fed beef, you're going to get a 1-to-1 ratio of omega-3 to omega-6. 1-to-1, or maybe 1-to-2, or maybe 1-to-3, something like that, but it's going to be very close. And just a brief summary, omega-3 is like an anti-inflammatory micronutrient. It's great for your health. And omega-6 is a pro-inflammatory micronutrient, which in certain quantities is great for your health as well. But the problem is, especially with the American diet, you typically have a huge mismatch between these two ratios. And obviously, as you know, everything taken to the extreme will cause pathologies in one form or another. So most omega-6s people get from like industrial seed oils or stuff of this sort. But even with cattle that are fed like grains during the finishing phase, what typically happens is you get probably an omega-3 to omega-6 ratio of like 1 to like 15, 1 to 20, something of that sort. Where remember what we mentioned with the grass-fed cattle, you get like 1-to-1 or something like very close to that kind of bracket and stuff of that sort. So obviously, if you're getting a lot of omega-6s in relation to omega-3s for prolonged periods of time, that could cause complications later on. Because remember, the inflammation theory of disease states that 99+% of diseases arise from chronic inflammation. Okay, now inflammation can happen from a variety of different reasons. So low-grade chronic stress, environmental pollutants, in this case, diet, et cetera, even getting like a cut or a wound, for example, will cause a bit of inflammation also, stuff of that sort. So it comes from a variety of topics, but what we're focusing on today is from the nutrition perspective. So when you're getting that grain finished beef, you're getting that mismatch of the omega-3 and omega-6 ratios, although the quantities themselves aren't actually that significant, so it's not like something to be super OCD paranoid about. But if you're looking for optimizing the nutritional profile and having a natural nutritional profile of that meat, I would personally recommend staying away from grains because it's not a species-specific diet. Another issue with grains is how are those grains sourced? So typically they're going to be coming from like a GMO or industrial agriculture type operations. And the bulk of these grains are going to be basically kind of like corn, soy, stuff like that, which definitely shoot the omega-6 up quite a bit in the meat. And then more importantly, how are all grains raised, even like, for example, any grains, even lentils, even beans, etc. How are they all raised? They're all raised through like a monocrop system. So you have this feedlot, but remember you have this feedlot full of cattle, but you have to remember when the animal can't go to the food because they're stuck in a cage basically, you have to bring the food to the animal. And the most economical thing to help them fatten up pretty quickly, gain a lot of weight in those 2 to 3 months so they can be sent to processing and the farmer can make the most money, is you got to feed them a bunch of grains. So typically they're going to be corn and soy. A large percentage of that feed is going to be via corn and soy, which gets the weight up quite a bit. It makes it actually the meat really fat. And the easiest way to visually tell if you're dealing with a grain finished piece of steak, for example, if you go to the grocery store these days, is you typically will see huge chunks of fat on the steak, grain finished and feedlot steak to be more exact, okay? You typically will see huge chunks of fat on the steak. And this is already a huge red flag that it comes from a confined operation because obviously if an animal is moving around all the time, it's going to be very lean and it's not going to have these huge clumps of fat on there. Also, typically a good indication that it's fed grains is it's very white. The fat is very, very bright white, almost kind of like, teeth that have been whitened, that white. And that's an indication that it's fed grains for sure because the actual natural fat of cattle that is raised on pasture, grass-fed and grass-finished or fed a species-specific diet is actually almost like yellow almost, okay? So there's another visual difference. Another thing you can try to do is take your thumb and kind of poke at the fat and you'll notice it's kind of like dried wax, like basically pushing on a candle, for example. It's very thick and you can't push into it, you know what I mean? And that's also an indication that it's grain finished as well because the fat naturally is very mushy, like melted wax, for example, very, very mushy, or clay, for instance. It's not supposed to be like that hard. So that's another visual indication. You don't even need a label. You could just look at it right over there. And also if the meat is very bright red, like almost glowing at you red, that's another indication that it's most likely grain finished beef, with a few exceptions on that statement there, because legit 100% grass-fed beef is going to be a very kind of like almost dark burgundy kind of purple color. It's definitely not going to be very red with huge white chunks of fat. It's going to be burgundy red, like very dark red, almost purple with yellow looking fat that's very mushy. So there's an easy indication of what you can look for. Another issue with sourcing, thank you, Chris. Jim, good to see you. Bill as well. Another issue with sourcing grain finished beef is if it doesn't have that USDA organic label on the package, those grains are going to be fed with a tremendous amount of synthetic biocides, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, rodenticides, just whatever that farm has an issue with, they're going to be spraying a lot of that chemical on there. Usually, like the most popular one is like a herbicide called glyphosate, okay? Or a Roundup, which has the main ingredient, the active ingredient of glyphosate. Adrian, good to see you. And you have to remember, whatever the animal eats, you also eat, so if they're eating a lot of these grains, and remember, these are like huge animals that are eating pounds and pounds and pounds of these grains every single day. So obviously all those synthetic biocides that are accumulated in the grains are going to bioaccumulate and magnify in the animal itself. So you're going to be getting a tremendous amount of trace amounts of various whatever chemicals or biocides they used on that specific operation in your system as well. And remember, it's a little bit troubling because the average newborn born in America these days, newborns, is already born with trace amounts of 200 different chemicals in their bloodstream that's brewing there 24/7, which I'm pretty sure is one of the main contributors to, not the only contributor, but one of the main contributors to why close to now 60% of Americans, or 50 to 60% of Americans, are developing cancer in their lifetime, and half of those Americans are dying from it. So it's very serious, guys, that you want to decrease that toxic load as much as possible. And one of the best and easiest ways to do that is just to be more selective about your food and be more consciously aware of what you're putting in your body. Of course, there's a lot more you have to do to really decrease your chance of cancer, but that is, I feel, the easiest thing to do that you can take action on, because at the end of the day, you got to eat, you have to eat. So you might as well be picking the right things that are showing respect for yourself. And don't worry, pretty much almost everyone, not everyone, no absolutes with these statements, but pretty much everyone has the money to shop for high quality food. If you look at, because the average American spends around $8,000 to $16,000 a year on non-essential expenses, alcohol, going out to fast food with friends, subscription services, you got to have that new iPhone. You really don't. I'm just being sarcastic here. Those designer jeans. I'm not even counting travel. So let's say travel is about $2,000 or $3,000 more. So you can see you got like $10,000 to $20,000 a year that the average American spends on like non-essential expenses, when they're not even like optimizing their health yet. You should optimize your health first and then figure out where the money can go next after that. Because at the end of the day, that's all you guys got. You got one body, you got one soul, you got one mind. And by buying that high quality food and eating it, showing respect to yourself, and that's the biggest sign of self-respect either. Like when people post a lot of times eating junk food and stuff of that sort, in my opinion, is just kind of like bragging about being poor, It's not a good thing to show, because it shows that the person doesn't have awareness of the topics we're talking about. It could be that too. But most likely they just don't have a sense of self-respect, and they're okay with, having a fat chest or a fat midsection and having these trace amounts of all these chemicals in their bloodstream and not feeling well. Most likely, the longer they stay on that path, the more they normalize pathology too. So in a long enough time frame, although they're very mentally and physically sick and not doing well at all, it's just a normal way of life for them. So they don't even think it's wrong at that point. And I've seen a lot of this when I was doing corporate health lectures. A lot of times I would have people fill out like HAQs, health assessment questionnaires. You guys don't know what that is, but it's basically like a tally of how they're doing mentally, physically, etc. And the bulk majority of people working in these environments are like in the red everywhere. I mean, they're full of mental and physical pathology. And when I say the bulk, I literally mean like 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 people. It's like almost everyone. And when you question them and ask them, they're like, most of them, not everyone, but most of them would say like, yeah, I feel totally fine. I'm doing okay. I do my boot camp, my 10,000 steps, etc., etc. And that's just an indication of how sick people have become and how normalized pathology has been. It's just totally normal now, and it's totally okay, when in reality it's not okay, and it's not serving anyone at all. Like, why live that way? Why live a life full of misery, obesity, and disease? There's so much better out there, for you to experience the one life you have. So take that into consideration. Grain finished beef, they are grown with all of these different biocides. They have to, if it's not that USDA organic, obviously the animal eats that. It's going to accumulate in the tissue of the animal. Then you're going to eat that animal as well. Another issue that's not too present with cattle, it's more present in poultry, for example, especially like egg poultry, is like AA or AA amyloid buildup in the tissue of the animal too. So the problem is when you confine animals into a small area, you have to understand that it's like very stressful. I mean, just use common sense. Imagine if you're stuck in a room with no place to go to the bathroom or whatever, in a confined room with like 30 people, where that room fits like 20 people, for example. obviously that's going to be like very stressful on you, and then obviously that's very stressful on the animals. And that's how factory farm operations, for the most part, operate, okay? Like the bulk majority of them operate that way because they're trying to maximize profits with limited space. So you got to stuff as many animals as possible into these operations. But when you do that, you create a very stressful environment for the animal, which inevitably lowers their immune system. Then you have to give them a lot of drugs as well, like antibiotics, for example, which need to be administered, especially if you're feeding the animal a non-species specific diet, if they're stressed, et cetera, then you get that antibiotic residue also. And my story with antibiotics is you got to be really careful with that stuff. And in my opinion, my personal opinion, I would never take that stuff unless it's like a life-threatening emergency. Like the only option is either take it or die, because there's a long time ago in maybe beginning of high school, I had terrible acne on my back. And obviously I did the normal route because I was too naive and too dumb. So I did what normally a lot of people would do, and that's go to the dermatologist and ask like, how could I get rid of this? And they're like, well, it's your genetics, and you know, you're growing, you're obviously in your 20s, and a lot of hormones are going on, and you're getting a lot of these breakouts, et cetera, et cetera. So take like doxycycline, which is what they gave me. I forgot the exact dose, but I always asked for the bare minimum, the lowest dose. And I already knew something was wrong with that approach because whenever I would travel overseas, for example, when I went to China, for instance, I would go backpacking, and obviously, you know, when you wear a backpack, your back is sweating like crazy, and I'll be eating, obviously China has a lot of fried food, etc. I'll be eating this food, all that stuff, and maybe taking a shower once every 2 or 3 days. And ironically, my skin would clear up completely, you know, but then when I returned back to the States, I all of a sudden started getting all these breakouts on my back again. And I'm like, what the hell is going on, you know? So I didn't listen to my instinct, and I listened to the dermatologist because I'm like, well, he's a doctor. He's also like a PhD as well. He's like an MD plus PhD. And I'm like, he must know what he's talking about, and or he wouldn't suggest it. And I took that stuff, and it actually did literally like absolutely nothing. It cleared up maybe 1 or 2 pimples out of the usually 10 I would have on my back. And then as a side effect, it actually kind of really messed up my gut microbiome, which took like 2 to 3 years to resolve, and a lot of fees for a good functional medicine registered dietitian. So you guys remember, when you're taking the medical approach, when you're taking these drugs, like Dr. Stuart McGill would say, there is no free lunch. Where you gain in one area, you must always lose in another area. So there are always side effects to any action you take in life. There are always side effects to any drug you take. You just have to be very consciously aware of these side effects and be completely okay with them, because you don't want like stuff like that to happen and then you're like, oh, you know, feeling like the victim and all sad because really you didn't do your research and kind of looked up to a father figure to make the decisions for you, but then sometimes they make mistakes, etc. They do their best, but that doesn't mean it's good enough to actually help you long term and not cause a myriad of other side effects. You got to take all these into considerations of being a functional, responsible adult, you know? So a lot of people lack that these days, and they're looking for quick answers from father figures, and there oftentimes is never a quick answer. I would say never a quick answer for even the simplest of mental or physical health challenges. It always requires like a very holistic approach, most likely dealing with a myriad of variables, 7, 8, 9, 10 different variables that have to be addressed all at the same time with the proper intensity to see a resolution of that symptom. If you want to truly see a resolution of that symptom, et cetera, unless you're, of course, into the pathological mindset of constantly chasing symptoms all your life, because you never want to get to the etiology of what led to all those problems. So you're got this thing today, got that thing tomorrow, got another thing the next day, got another thing the next day. And you're getting sicker and sicker and worse looking year after year, and you're wondering why. So that's another thing to consider. So basically, when the animals are confined, they're stressed out, so their liver starts producing a lot of serum amyloid A proteins. And in small amounts or moderate amounts, it's totally okay. But when it's on full blast and a person is under a lot of, or the animal is under a lot of chronic stress, those serum amyloid A proteins, which are soluble and kind of break apart into the body, start breaking up into AA amyloid proteins, which are insoluble and actually started forming as plaque, mainly around the organ tissue of the animal, but also to a smaller extent around the muscle tissue of the animal. And then you eat that. So obviously you're going to inherit those AA amyloid proteins, which are inevitably going to most likely, although there hasn't been so much research done on humans consuming meat tainted with AA amyloid proteins, just my presumption is from all the research I've been able to find, and you're welcome to email me and I can send you this research. I have about 12 different studies on AA amyloid buildup in animals, and most likely it's going to build up in your tissue as well. And you have to remember that old Native American saying, if you're kind of more on the spiritual side, if you eat the flesh of a miserable animal, which these animals are in a confined situation, you're going to inherit that misery as well, okay? So there's that aspect to it too, if you like looking at it from that perspective. So there are some things to consider right there, just from the feedlot grain or grass-fed grain finished beef, okay, which is pretty much a lot of the beef you're going to find at the supermarket. I personally stay away from that stuff because these animals are huge, and if they eat a lot of these grains, which are grown with a lot of synthetic biocides, inevitably they're going to accumulate into the flesh of this animal, and that's definitely going to increase your toxic load as well. And who knows, a lot of these chemicals for safety, they've actually, as a complete formulation, never even been tested for safety. It's a surprise to most, but honestly, all the resources are right there online, present to anyone. You could even read the book called The Myth of Safe Pesticides by, I believe, Andre Leu. It's been a long time since I read that book, but a great, easy breakdown. You guys have to remember, with most pesticides that are used in farming, the complete formulation is never ever tested for safety before it's applied to the food that you're actually eating. And what I mean by that is, in chemical formulation, you have two main components. You have the active ingredient, and you have supporting inactive ingredients, which are meant to enhance the potency and the lethality of the active ingredient. So for safety testing, all that's really required to do is just to test the active ingredient in isolation on its own. Never the complete formulation. You would think that's actually the common sense thing to take, what you see at Home Depot, that weed sprayer, and spray it on the food and then test it for safety. That would be like what I would personally do. It's not done like that. What's done is they test that active ingredient in isolation, that one ingredient in isolation on its own. And next time you go to Home Depot, you can look at the back of this thing called a Roundup, and it'll say it right there: active ingredient, glyphosate, inactive ingredients, probably like 10 or 15 different guys right there. So that's kind of the equivalent of basically saying like, bullets don't kill people, Of course, bullets in and of themselves don't kill people. Sure, you need the gun, and then you need a person that's willing to hurt other people to use that gun while it's loaded to kill the person. So it's kind of like something like saying of that sort. I know that's an extreme example, but me saying like, oh, bullets don't kill people. Well, sure, they don't, objectively speaking, unless you throw it really hard at the person or something like that. You need a couple of different components, and that's how these chemicals work. For a complete formulation to work, you need all of the components, but all of the components together as a complete formulation are never tested for safety. So no one really knows at the end of the day what these chemicals are doing to you. The only person testing these complete formulations that I'm aware of is some guy in France. I think it's Seralini Labs. I got to double check, okay? Seralini Labs. And every time they tested the complete formulation, the active ingredient proved to be far more lethal in combination with the active ingredient than the active ingredient in isolation of the inactive ingredients. And of course, because that's what the inactive ingredients are there to do, is to make the inactive ingredient a lot more lethal, so the pesticide could work a lot better in terms of killing living organisms. Last time I checked too, we're living organisms. Maybe some people's spirits have died in their 20s and they're just kind of counting down the days, but at the end of the day, the biological system is a living organism, and that's what these pesticides are meant to kill, a living organism. So just start using a little bit of common sense here and there, and you'll start getting real answers on how to optimize your health, which I feel one of the easiest ways to do so is simply to optimize your diet, because you have total control over that. It's in, like I mentioned, most people's budgets. Average person is spending $8,000 to $16,000 a year on non-essential expenses, shit that is just causing them to be broke, obese, unattractive, and full of disease. You know, come on. I mean, what kind of pathology circle is that? You know, you're causing your own pain and misery by buying that alcohol, that fast food, all that shit. That's really not adding any value to your life or your day whatsoever. Come on, there's a better life out there, guys. And it's the good thing is you're doing it to yourself. And if you're doing it to yourself, you can stop doing it to yourself by start thinking for yourself, you know, instead of just going blindly, unconsciously through the motions and destroying your quality of life in various ways. So that's my take on grain finished beef. Now you have a couple of other options too. You have grass fed. Sometimes it says grass fed on the label, which really, like I mentioned in the beginning, doesn't mean that much. All cattle are grass fed. It literally doesn't say anything unique or special if you just see the grass fed label. Sometimes you do see the grass fed and grass finished label. And that one can be a little bit deceiving too, because you have to remember a lot of the grass-fed claims aren't regulated, you know? So literally I can just claim anything. I can claim like, hey, I'm selling you grass-fed, grass-finished beef, and that's pretty much it. I know it's shocking to believe that, but that's just how it works. And a lot of times, like, for example, you could feed your cattle grass for like 8 months, put them on grains for like 2 months, and finish them a week on grass. And it's still technically grass-fed and grass-finished. I'm not lying to you. So that happens sometimes as well, because you got to remember, agriculture is a competitive market these days. It's an international market as well, which makes it more competitive and stuff of that sort. So it's tough to be a farmer. It's not easy. I volunteered a lot of operations. I also kind of grew up, luckily, to be raised off-grid by my grandmother in Ukraine way back in the day. This is way during my younger years. It's not that easy of a lifestyle, although the off-grid thing was more like a self-sustaining thing, which I feel is much easier to do than a commercial operation where you actually rely on it for a living, et cetera, et cetera. It's not an easy job. It's competitive. It's basically you're working 7 days a week because you can't leave these animals, stuff of that sort. So it is pretty taxing. And if someone's falling behind, they'll be more tempted to kind of cut corners here and there. But usually you get that in like bigger operations, typically bigger operations that supply grocery stores, because they're like under the gun. Grocery stores are very like regimented. We need these quantities every week. But a really good grass-fed pasture-raised operation will never be able to supply those predictable quantities because of like weather fluctuations, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of times they would attract the more, how do I say, quote unquote, business-minded cattle rancher that's willing to kind of, you know, think business and money first versus quality and honesty, et cetera, from my observation. So the best thing you can do if you want like a legitimate grass-fed, grass-finished beef supplier that's 100% pasture-raised is you could do what I did, and that's volunteer at ranches. But that's not a possibility for a lot of people, nor is it that deep of an interest. I actually had a good interest in it, so it was fun for me. So the next thing you can do is just go to this website called AmericanGrassFed.org and scroll to the bottom of the website and click on that interactive map and find a supplier in your area that ships to you. And actually, it doesn't even need to be in your area. It could be multiple states away, and pretty much all of them ship to you as well. So you don't need to be totally focused on the local area unless you want to support the local farmers, which is totally cool too. A lot of them ship overseas. Like I love azgrassraisedbeef.com. Great website, very professional. They can get the beef to your house in 2 days. They ship it to you. It's flash frozen, which is a good thing because when they process the animal, they pretty much freeze it close to the processing date so that nutritional profile is preserved in the meat. So then when you defrost it, it's pretty much like fresh meat. But at the grocery store, you don't know how long it's been sitting out there, how diligent the workers are with keeping everything on point, et cetera, et cetera. Just some other small variables to focus on. So I'm totally okay with flash frozen meat. In fact, prefer that over fresh oftentimes, okay? Especially with fish. I only buy frozen fish, okay? Uh, uh, I never buy fresh fish at the grocery store, pretty much ever, okay? So you can go to that website and you can order from them. And ironically, it's because of like the whole thing in Ukraine these days, at least from the AZ grass-raised beef supplier, which is an AGA certified beef supplier. AGA is American Grass-Fed Association. That's kind of like one of the gold standards of grass-fed beef certification. They actually do on-site inspections during various seasons of the operations, et cetera, and make sure it's like legitimate pasture-raised, legitimate grass-fed operation, stuff of that sort, which doesn't happen literally anywhere, period. If you want to be a grass-fed supplier in the US, you just say you're grass-fed, you fill out some paperwork, and you're good to go, and people have to take your word for it. And one of my friends, Dr. Jason Runtree, which is an agricultural researcher, actually did a study where they pulled a lot of commercials. So they went to the grocery store and bought, I think, like 18 different brands of grass-fed beef. And pretty much half of them had the nutritional profile of grain-finished beef. So right there is a perfect example of it's very hard to find legitimate grass-fed beef in the US. And a lot of these labels, they could mean they're legit, but maybe not, probably not, most oftentimes not in my experience. Okay, so if you want like a legitimate certification, American Grass-Fed Association stamp, go to that website I mentioned, americangrassfed.org. The only grocery stores I see that sell AGA certified beef, at least in my area, is like Natural Grocers, for example. I'm pretty sure there are other grocery stores that sell those, but I'm just not familiar with every single one because I mostly order online for my beef products anyways. So like I loved azgrassraisedbeef.com. If you're in the Southern California area, a great, like legitimate beef supplier is like the number 5 barbeef.com. So the number 5 barbeef.com. It's run by Frank Fitzpatrick. So I actually volunteered on that ranch for over a year. And his cattle are basically like wild cattle. So he doesn't clip the bulls. He doesn't dehorn them. No vaccines, no antibiotics, no beta agonists, no steroids, whatever. There's so many different chemicals and drugs used in the cattle industry. You want to try to stay away from that stuff as much as possible, okay? Just to once again decrease that overall toxic load in your body and let your body live a natural life free of chemicals, okay? And you got to take this a bit seriously because once again, like I mentioned, close to half of people develop cancer within their lifetime and half of those die from it. So for example, next time you go to lunch with some friends, let's say there are 4 of you, 2 of you will develop cancer and 1 will die from it. So it's pretty damn serious, man. And you have to take it seriously. It means overall you have a 25% chance of dying from cancer, which is super high. Remember the whole COVID scare? I think that was like 0.001% for most people in the population. And people were really worried and scared about that. But I'm like, wait a minute, you have a 25% chance of dying from cancer because of poor lifestyle and nutritional habits. Now there's so many other things to consider. I'm just trying to briefly summarize here. And you're not worried about that 25% chance of dying in cancer. It's pretty freaking brutal. It will kick your ass, even if you survive and stuff of that sort. But you are worried about this 0.01% chance of dying from COVID. It's like, come on, man. You got to use your brain a little bit, even if you have only a little bit to use. Okay? It doesn't require that much analytic skills to really see the ridiculousness in that. Okay? So that's what I would do, 5 bar beef, but doesn't use any of that shit. The cattle, he's been actually growing this herd for, I would say, like 20, 30 years. And the cattle that couldn't survive in that specific environment end up dying out. And the ones that could ended up breeding to build resilient offspring that are able to flourish and survive in that environment, because those are the only ones that survived to be able to breed anyways. And that's basically how it gets away without having to use like medicine, vaccines, all that stuff, okay? Because they're already genetically basically bred, or not even selectively bred, just by nature to survive in that exact environment. I'm going to grab a drink really quick, guys, and then we're going to continue. If you guys have any questions, Larry, Sebastian, Mario, let me know. These calls are for you guys, okay? I'll be happy to answer them if I'm able to. Okay, so 5-bar beef, AZ grass-raised beef, AmericanGrassFed.org are all great resources if you want legitimate grass-fed beef, okay? Obviously, you can go volunteer at ranches, but for a lot of people, that's not realistic because it's very time-consuming. Nor is it like a big interest for a lot of people too. So there's that aspect of it as well. So there we go. We covered that. A lot of times too, you guys have to remember that USDA organic label. You might see that somewhere on beef packaging. That doesn't mean it's grass-fed and grass-finished. That just means it's USDA organic certified, which means basically the grains aren't grown supposedly with synthetic biocides, and antibiotics weren't used, or steroids weren't used, GMO ingredients weren't used. All those things, I would say the USDA organic label is still really strong with, preventing the use of synthetic biocides, preventing the use of steroids, preventing the use of antibiotics as well, and preventing the use of genetically modified organisms. So I'd still say the USDA organic label is very strong in those areas. But when you see that label on food packaging, it in no way means it's pasture raised and grass-fed, grass-finished, in no way. Now, if you see that label, plus you see like AGA certified label, or you see like a 100% grass-fed label or something of that sort, then yes, okay, that's probably a legitimate product. But you can't just see that label and think automatically that's what the average consumer thinks, but it's not the case that like, oh, it's pasture raised, it's 100% grass-fed, et cetera, et cetera. Also, to make it a little bit trickier, guys, sometimes it says pasture raised, but not grass-fed and grass-finished. So sometimes they do leave them on pasture, but they feed them like a lot of grains towards the last like 1 or 2 months. Typically what they do is bring huge bins out, like trash can bins basically, filled with a lot of grain. Chris, there is a great website for you called eatwild.com. Go to the top left, click on, it's been a little while for me since I've been on that website. Click on eggs, milk, and meat or something like that. Tab there, and it'll show you a map of the US and Canada. Click on Canada, click on the region you want to focus on, and go from there. That's a great resource for you, okay? I don't know if any of those websites from AmericanGrassFed.org ship to Canada, but reach out to them. Many of them are in the Washington area, like way closer to like the North Cascades, for example, Montana area. So they're pretty close to Canada. But once again, I don't know. I never kind of did that international kind of shipping type of deal. So I don't know. But let me know. If you find out, do let me know. That'd be great info to know, because a few people from Canada have reached out to me after I wrote the book, which is mostly like an American-based market, asking those questions, and I just referred them to that eatwild.com. But if they're able to order from AmericanGrassFed.org and have it shipped over there, that'd be a great resource as well. So I think I was talking about the USDA organic label. So sometimes, guys, don't be confused by that, okay? If you see that, even if they have a picture of like a beautiful pasture and, you know, the cows are all happy and stuff of that sort. Usually from my experience, especially at the grocery store level, if you see that USDA organic label, it's just basically kind of like a factory farmed operation with organic inputs. So instead of using instead of using grains that are grown with a bunch of synthetic biocides, they use grains that are grown with a bunch of organically approved biocides. So it's better than the synthetic stuff, I feel, but also, I mean, there's a lot of flexibility in that statement too, which I'm not going to get into today because that's a pretty long conversation. So So there's just a quick breakdown, okay, guys? It's not as black and white as you think in terms of this is good food, this is bad food. And I hope that demystifies it. It took me a long time, a freaking long time, 4 years of spending about at least like 10, 15 hours a week, if not more, of research to develop that second book that I put together in like a very easy format. And then volunteering on a bunch of farms, et cetera, et cetera. And I also already had a background in kind of farming from living on that off-grid farm, et cetera. So it was still very confusing for me. And that way I could understand why it's so confusing for people that don't have that farming background. You're totally kind of lost, basically. But look, you guys, once again, changing your nutrition, it's like the thing you have the most power over and the easiest to change, in my opinion, okay? And will produce, honestly, great results. You can cure pretty much any skin issue, not any, but the majority of skin issues. You definitely won't be, you'll never be obese eating pasture-raised meat, wild fish, wild game, organic crops. You'll never become obese eating that way, okay? And just by that, remember, whenever you lose body fat, your inflammation, systemic inflammation in your body goes down a tremendous amount. And whenever that happens, all your biological markers improve as well. Okay? So you have the money. Pretty much everyone on this call has the money, okay? The average American spends $8,000 to $16,000 a year on non-essential expenses. I guarantee you, if you look through your expenses this weekend, you will see you probably fit somewhere within that bracket. And the average 2,000 calorie USDA organic certified diet is about 4,500-ish a year, okay? Maybe a little bit more these days. That's based off the numbers I calculated when I finished my book a few years back. So if you have $8,000 to $16,000 a year on activities and behaviors that are making you obese, unattractive, and full of disease and miserable because of that, you have $4,500 to help correct that as well. It's all about self-respect and knowing the right moves to take, okay? So it's the perfect opportunity to make that change this weekend. Everyone's going shopping, so might as well buy the stuff that is going to help you look better, help you feel better, et cetera, okay? All right, guys. So Mario, thanks for jumping in. If you guys don't have any other questions, I'm going to call it a day today and enjoy my weekend. And obviously, I wish the best for you guys and hope you guys enjoy your weekend. Please remember, put yourself first, okay? Make sure to show your self-respect by putting your mental and physical health first. Because if you don't have your needs met first, whatever you do is not going to work out for you long term unless you're going to be miserable. So make sure you clearly identify your core values and you have those values met at your workplace, especially because you're spending 8 hours a day there, 5 days a week for most people. In your relationship, because once again, you're spending a lot of time in those two areas and in other aspects of your life. And remember to put your mental and physical health first, because no one's going to be there for you if you get sick. Almost no one. And the people that do show up there, you're going to be kind of dragging them down because you're sick and you're unhealthy. And now they have to help and attend to you because they love you. And it's going to be emotionally draining for them. And honestly, so much disease is so preventable. We have now in America almost 800,000 to 900,000 Americans dying of heart attacks every single year. Almost a freaking million. And it's so easy to prevent that. It's so easy. It's almost insulting when that happens. We have almost now 100,000 Americans dying of type 2 diabetes every single year. And type 2 diabetes, especially the heart disease, it takes effort. You have to invest a lot of money, a lot of conscious effort into abusing yourself that much. Yeah, you got to go out there and you got to buy that food to make yourself so overweight. You got to take the time to go buy that food. You have to take the time to eat that food. You have to take the time to reinforce that belief system that makes that acceptable. It's an effort. You got to really want it. I know a lot of people say, oh, doing your lifestyle, it takes effort. It takes like very little effort, honestly, when you have the right systems in place. But being obese takes, being overweight, being very sick, takes a lot of effort. Cancer development takes a good 10, 15, 20 years of self-abuse to actually form, in most cases. Okay? No absolutes, of course, but that is the general rule. It takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of effort on your part. And like I say, if you're doing it to yourself, you can stop doing it to yourself once you start respecting yourself more and being very clear on your core values and what benefits you in life. Yeah, so Randy, I know, like I tell people, like, dude, Randy's a former client of mine for you guys. I've had a chance to interview him. He's made a great transformation at 59 as well. I don't know how to post the pictures here or whatever, but you guys can check out. I'll post the interview later on. And it's a lot easier than you guys think, okay? I work out like freaking 4 days a week. I have Randy working out 4 days a week. He's 59. He's like ripped and like pretty muscular as well, okay? 4 days a week, 45 to 60 minutes a day, and then having good systems and automated systems to kind of make your meals quick. At the end of the day, guys, it all comes down to making a decision that it's time to show yourself respect, and enough is enough, especially for your 40, 50, 60, 70-year-old males out there. Enough is enough. No more excuses, okay? No more like, I'm going to put my health first, my mental and physical health first when I get that next promotion, when I get this project out of the way, when I do this and that, or when, whatever. That's it. Enough is enough. You've done it long enough, and it hasn't benefited you at all. Oftentimes, you've sacrificed yourself for a job that'll get rid of you in seconds. And what are you left with? A broken mind, a broken body. Probably they'll send you a get well soon card the first year and then forget about you the second year, and stuff of that sort. Spend so much time kind of devoting to that company or whatever the hell you're doing, and they're not going to care about you, man. Not because it's necessarily their fault, but they're worried about other projects, getting everything done. So are the people in that company that you probably spent a lot of time trying to become friends with, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sure many of you have experienced this. You left a company and pretty much like almost no one contacts you to check on you. Maybe there's one person here and there, maybe. So that's a more example that you have to come first, because that's all you got, man. You got you, that's it. I think a lot of people have forgot that a long time ago and put themselves last. And you got to be selfish. If you want something to last long term and you want to be happy in the process, you have to make sure your needs are met first. That's it. There are no ifs or buts about it. Because if your needs aren't met, you're going to go disgruntled towards that work, that coworker, that boss, because at the end of the day, you're being fake to yourself. You want to be doing this, but you're forced to do this at another job, for example, and you're going to go disgruntled towards that work, and it's going to cause a cycle of misery. Same thing with relationships. If a person especially doesn't accept you for who you are, that's a disaster. That's a disaster. That will not work. Okay, so if you like living a health conscious lifestyle, but this person likes getting smashed at the bars every weekend, there's a huge disconnect of core values right there. If for some reason you guys do end up staying together long term, both of you will be miserable. Okay? You need to be clear about your core values, crystal clear, and make sure your environment reflects those core values. The wider the gap, the more mental and physical pain you're going to have in your life. Okay? That's it. It's that simple. And no amount of boot camps, keto, fasting, all this other bullshit is going to help you, because you didn't create the environment to facilitate health conscious living. Okay? And that's it. So I wish you guys the best this weekend and have a good one. Okay, take care, guys.